Welcome to Stories That Work. This is take two. I am Father Matthew Howell, your guest host today. Deacon Adam Roberts is, as they say in the business, on assignment. And so I was the first guest on Stories That Work, and I am now the first guest host. I'm excited to be here. We are also making Stories That Work history as we are broadcasting from an undisclosed location on my back deck. And we have a live audience. My chickens, actually, they're my wife's chickens, but they are back there somewhere. And they will be working on Father Fred's honorarium for his appearance here. So, Father Fred Shaheen, welcome to the show. Father Fred is the pastor of St. George Antiochian Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and he'll be getting a dozen eggs in the mail next week as a thank you for coming on the show with the unqualified guest host. Father Fred is here to talk about teaching English and literature and poetry to our youth. And the reason why that is, this continues a series that Deacon Adam has been doing the last few weeks since the Archdiocese Convention. Now, I know, Father Fred, you were not at the convention because you were on the front lines of youth work as a priest at camp while the convention was going on, and we thank you for that service. But at the convention, the topic of youth work and retaining our youth in the church was the number one topic. It was discussed every day in every workshop. It seems like every meal that I was at, everywhere that I went, I heard people talking about this, and so did Deacon Adam. And so the episodes the last few weeks have been with guests who are talking about the importance of teaching our youth various subjects and how it relates to the faith. So our subject today is teaching our youth English literature and poetry. And Father Fred, it's good to have you with us. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start with your credentials and your background as to why you were chosen as a guest for this special topic.
Well, wonderful. I'm happy to be here as well. My background is in English literature. I studied that in college and in graduate school. And for me, it was a starting point for going into the ministry of the priesthood, which at the time didn't seem like the most natural thing. I mean, you always kind of wonder, like, I'm studying this, what is it going to lead to? And when I was growing up, I was always drawn toward literature and the topic of English. But I'd always get questions or challenges from people. So, what are you going to do with that? Can you make a career out of that? I didn't know the answer to that question. And I still don't know if I do. However, I think as a Christian, and this is what I'm here to say, as a Christian, as a faithful person, as a priest, as somebody growing up and wanting to be grounded in the faith, I think having a grasp of being literate and appreciating our language and how we communicate our faith through stories is something that's of utmost importance. I learned that firsthand, I think, going into the seminary after having studied English literature in college and at the graduate level. Think about how so much of our faith is communicated to us in story form, in narratives. I'll just say it's no accident that, and no coincidence that when you go to church and you hear the gospel readings during the normal times of the year, if we're not during Pascha to Pentecost or during the Lenten Triodian, we're going to hear readings from really two gospel books, right? Matthew and Luke. And it's because those are primarily the storytelling gospels. They have the most amount of parables. We're going to be in church and we're going to hear a story about a man had two sons, or the kingdom of heaven is like. This is how it's communicated to us. And as people, we appreciate narrative and we make connections with the world and to our faith through stories. So that's really important, I think, as a faithful person, and getting young people to appreciate that and relate to the world around them and to the importance of their faith, I think is a good way of grounding them and keeping them rooted in in the orthodoxy.
Yeah, I totally agree. And when you think about the synoptic gospels that you mentioned, especially Matthew and Luke, the narratives that are in there, Jesus doesn't come out and just say point blank, do this, do that. He couches it in a narrative so people can remember it, so they can take it with them, carry it with them in their heart, so to speak, and even wrestle with it. It's not always clear. Even the disciples, right, didn't understand when he was talking about a sower and his seed, and the disciples asked him, and he finally explained it to him. But many of the parables he doesn't explain point blank. He lets us wrestle with that.
That's right.
Father Fred, if you can tell us how your with your background, with your qualifications, what are you going to be doing with the St. Athanasius Academy of Orthodox Theology with the youth relating to this topic? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we're going to be presenting them an opportunity to appreciate, I think, and engage literature. Maybe students have difficulty with it. Maybe they don't like it. Maybe they're not readers. They don't have an appreciation for it already. But to plant in them some sort of appreciation and to show them, like I said, connections to the world and to their faith. If we can get them to enjoy reading a short story or seeing in a short story something that might relate to them or something they've experienced, my method of learning way back was always to read an essay or a piece and then apply it to yourself, write your own, think about a similar experience you had. If you hear about somebody undergoing something or speaking about a topic, you write your own take on that topic and draw your own experiences. So it really connects people. If we can get young people to engage in that, and also in a sense that's literate and informed, I think that's important. Deacon Adams said, being literate is the normal today. It wasn't always in history. We were always taught, and we learned the Gospels by being in church. Of course, we still do primarily, but the normal for culture and society is to be informed. We have access to the Bible all around us. I have an app on my phone that I can read it, or it can read it to me, but there's no excuse for not having it. But what we want to do is to teach the young people to engage, or at least introduce them to engagement.
Yes, I think that's the challenge that every priest and every parent is struggling with, is getting our kids to engage, right? And in the church and in the critical thinking process, right? The process of discernment. One of the best classes that I ever took in high school, I did not do well. My grades were not good in the class, but because the teacher was he was really good and he really pushed us. But it was my sophomore year of high school, and this teacher kept telling us, I'm going to teach you how to think. I'm going to teach you how to think. And that class helped me for the rest of high school, all through college, all through seminary. And he helped us to not only think critically, but to articulate those thoughts in a way that would allow other people to give feedback on those thoughts. And I think the more you engage in literature and poetry, the more critical thinking you can come away with. And then when we apply that to the church, to our life in the church, how should we behave? What should we believe? All these things, I think it's a very important skill for young people to do and to have. So with your role in the academy, you will be a tutor. Is that correct?
Yes, a tutor.
And what grades are you tutoring?
The middle school.
Okay, so why middle school? Why aren't you doing this for high schoolers? Why are you starting at that particular grade as opposed to another age?
So I'm plugging in where there's a need. I can be available at other times for the high schoolers. It's not an intentional focusing on my part for an age group.
Okay.
There seems to be a need for that, or maybe that's where they stumble or struggle or really start to wrestle with having to maybe deal with a topic they don't like. Maybe not everyone likes to read or engage or can do it, in a competent way. I think middle
Okay.
school is when we start to have those difficulties where it matters how well you read and how much you can read.
Yeah, my son is going into seventh grade, and we're right in the thick of all of that, reading and analyzing what we read, and discerning and filtering what we read. Father, can you tell us a little bit about some of the specific topics or selections that you plan on having in your tutoring class?
Yeah, well, a collection of short stories that made an impression on me is 9 stories by J.D. Salinger, and they're from different narrators and different scenarios. He draws on a lot of things from a fictional family, the Glass family. So those 9 stories and the various characters and scenarios that come up in there, as well as a longer piece, a novel called Franny and Zooey, which Franny and Zooey are 2 of 7 siblings in that Glass family. A lot of it has to do with coincidentally or as a matter of fact, their relationship with God and how they've been taught the faith and how that's expressed in the way they interact with one another. There's a lot of what I like to call epiphany moments in the Salinger stories where you're going along and you're not really expecting this, but a sudden revelation happens. And then the character is enlightened and the reader experiences that as well. Like, this is what's really going on. This is what was happening in her mind, and this is what she needed to see. And now it's so obvious. It's kind of cathartic and conclusive, and it really gets you to that place. So literature can be fun like that. It could be like an adventure and a way of teaching through short stories, not biting off too much, not saying, take this novel home, it's 300 pages and read it by the weekend. We might have difficulty struggling through something like that, but we're using the shorter pieces.
Okay. All right. As a springboard, so to speak, to get into the process and of critical thinking and applying. You mentioned J.D. Salinger, and his writing, his characters, more than anything, are authentic. Authentic. They're sometimes raw. Of course, his most famous novel is Catcher in the Rye, and the character in there is very raw, but and sometimes profane. But can you talk a little bit about this issue of authenticity in Salinger's writings? I find it interesting that you're going to use his short stories. And with these characters, with epiphany moments, when what I hear from young people is they want authenticity more than anything in what they believe and who believes it. They see through hypocrisy so quickly. So do you want to comment about Salinger and authenticity and the appeal of using some of his stories?
I think so. To J.D. Salinger, which probably a lot of people, was Catcher in the Rye, which you mentioned. And when I first encountered that, I was surprised and shocked that I would be reading something like that in a school context, in a learning context, because, there is some profanity in there. He's a Holden Caulfield, sorry, the narrator, he's very much at odds with the world around him, and he's in the process of sort of dropping out and questioning everything, questioning his future, the path that his parents set him on, what he wants to do meaningful in life. But he's primarily railing against what he perceives as phoniness and falseness around him in the structures, in society, in authority, in the education system, just phony people. He has a word, a very pungent word for them. At all times. So I connected with that. It seemed unfiltered, and you mentioned raw. And I think as a person, we look for authenticity. There's beauty in that, even if it's coming out in a profane way or in a way that's not particularly beautiful. I think we find in authenticity truths that we can relate to. And I found that with Salinger, with Catcher in the Rye, and going on to the shorter stories too. He's really kind of a master at capturing that truth through authenticity, and then in the details finding some moment that we can relate to in our own lives. I'll tell you, when I was in the 6th grade, and this is the middle school years we're talking about, I had a teacher, Patty Larkin was her name. I remember her well.
Shout out to Mrs. Larkin.
Yes,
if she's watching.
And Patty did something very unconventional. She read to us in the classroom. So these are 6th graders. We know how to read. We're given reading assignments all the time. We had our own responsibilities and things we were expected to do on our own. But she took time in the classroom during quiet time, during free time, at the end of a lesson, to read to us. And it, for me, was like being, this is 6th grade. It felt like being in kindergarten and 1st grade again, in a very good way. I heard this voice, and I'll tell you, she read to us The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. And there's a lot of drama and intrigue and stuff going on, like with growing up and getting involved in, there's gangs and things like that. But it was exciting. And to be able to follow that and to feel like I was being led into a love of storytelling by a teacher in the 6th grade was, you can't even describe that. I consider her a teacher that could have said, go do this, go read this, and we'll talk about it. But rather she did it for us. She showed us, that expression, you show somebody, if you're a good teacher, you don't just tell them. Well, Patty showed us, and she did it for us. You can't put a value on that, being present with them and leading them almost by the hand into a love of literature. And I think that really helped me engage with books as I grew older. It was like watching a movie and being, like I said, walked through by the teacher, all of us together. It's a great memory.
Good. Well, it's you're obviously very passionate about this, and we are looking forward to seeing how you can translate that through your tutoring class in the academy. Mm-hmm. And now the difficulty you're going to have, though, is that your class is going to be online, yes. Right? Mm-hmm. So that just presents a minor obstacle, in that you aren't actually physically with the students, but you can still convey your zeal and enthusiasm for the stories and for the process of analyzing and drawing out the symbolism to your students. So I know everybody at the St. Athanasius Academy is excited about your class coming up, especially for those who have their students enrolled. So one other thing that's part of this topic is poetry. We haven't talked about poetry yet. And I'm not even sure where to jump off with poetry. I guess I'll ask a very pointed question, okay?
Yeah.
You're dealing with middle schoolers. Mm-hmm. How do you make poetry interesting to middle schoolers?
Well, very good. Now, you, I think, hit on it when you mentioned being online, because we are going to be engaged. It's remote, but there are faces and there are voices, and we'll be in real time. So thank God for that, because poetry has something going for it. It's rhythmic, it's sounds, it's musical, it's lyrical. And some of that, a good portion of it, can be conveyed in a lesson type setting. We can't go through a whole short story or a short novel. We can read parts of it. But I think a lot of the effects of poetry and the good qualities of appreciating it come out in the rhythm, the cadences, and what we hear. So actually reading it and engaging it with them, a la Patty Larkin, I think is going to do a lot of good toward maybe getting somebody who doesn't think they like poetry, or maybe doesn't understand it, and that's fine. You don't always understand it, at least to engage it and want to know more. And, I see how that connects, You got to go look that word up. These poets were writing in a time when some of the references, we don't know exactly what they are, but once we place them in context, it opens up worlds I think, for us in connecting to our own worlds. So I'm
Sure.
looking forward to that. I think the key to that is in the sounds, in the rhythms, and in the musicality of poetry itself. It has something to offer that prose doesn't, for the most part.
Yeah, and the poetry, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but the poetry is written um, and can connect, is written from and can connect to a deeper part of the heart or the person than just the narrative prose. And I find this most evident in the Psalms of David, right? Where he's going through all the emotions and experiences of every man, from joy to despair to grief to anger to everything in between. Um, so, what kind of poetry do you have lined up? Oh, there's a military base real close to my house, so they're flying a Black Hawk overhead.
Yeah, I
Sorry about that.
that's okay.
Uh,
Um,
so, what kind of poetry do you have lined up to study with
um,
in this coming year?
a few of the poets that I've enjoyed are the modern British poets of the early 20th century. James, well, William Butler Yeats, excuse me, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and a few others, um, who are, like any good poet, they weave really the reality of their environment and their language and culture and what they see in their environment, and they make it through their words universal, you know. Like you mentioned, the Psalms of David, of course. This is God's word to us, written through a lyrical poet, a musical person like David, the great prophet and king. But to translate into words a universal emotion, I mean, if you hear those Psalms and you hear how they take a person through every phase of being, you know, from the depths of despair to the high praises of God and everything in between, you're going to find something that you connect to. That's the beauty of poetry. Something is going to click with you. It may not be everything at all times, but if it's good and if it's true, it has that universal way of making connections between people. And I appreciate that myself because, like a lot of people, I mean, not everybody, but sometimes I suffer with the disease of the introvert. I can be outgoing, I can be forthright, I can be social, and I enjoy that. But there are times when I'm really reflective. And I think early on, middle school and early high school, literature and words, and that was really my way of connecting through music too, listening to music, making connections to the world around me and other people through the words of poets. So I'm very thankful for that. It's a way of bringing me out of that disease, if you might say. I joke,
Bring,
disease of introvert. I mean, we're supposed to be community people. We're supposed to connect, but sometimes we don't want to, and it's kind of in our genetic makeup. I think it's part of our brokenness too. I'll confess
sure,
that.
sure. So, what I'm hearing about English literature, poetry, the few themes and buzzwords that I keep hearing are connection and authenticity and reality. Um, and I think those are all very important things. Uh, and those are things that when I talk to youth, that's what they want.
Mhm.
As when I was a younger man, that's what I wanted. I wanted connection with real, authentic people, and so I'm excited for what you're bringing to the table, and I'm excited for any of your students who are signed up. There's a link in the comment section to the St. Athanasius Academy of Orthodox Theology. There are also other homeschooled tutorials to be used as resources for parents. And parents are encouraged to silently audit the class with the students so that you know what's being taught and what's being said, although the participation is for the students. Um, Also, there are plenty of other resources out there, if you have any questions about literature, Father Fred, can people contact you to discuss more about the literature and poetry or some of the ideas that you've talked about? And could they go to your church website and find your contact info?
They sure can. stgeorgecedarrapids.org. When you fill out the contact page, when you go to that contact page, it'll go to, that email goes to me, so I'll see it.
Okay.
They can also look for me on Facebook. I'm Fred Shaheen.
Okay.
I look like
wonderful. Well, Father Fred, before we end the broadcast, I'd give you room for two things. Number one, I'd like you to introduce the fellow who's standing behind you. And then number two, I'll give you any last words or any final thoughts on the topic.
So who is behind me? Yeah, you see my knight in, it's not exactly shining armor, but his name's George. And I found him at a garage sale a while back. That's one of the things I enjoy doing, looking at garage sales and at charity shops, as they call them. You never know what you're going to find. When you find a knight like this and they ask $20 for him, you don't leave him there. You take him home. I didn't know what I was going to do with him, but he ended up in my office and he stands by.
Is he going to be your teacher's aide?
I'm thinking this is going to be exactly where I'm sitting when we're having the lessons. So if I need any kind of backing or
ask George what he thinks.
Ask George. He's got my back, right?
Oh, that's funny. Well, Father, any last words, any final thoughts about this topic or about the importance of parents reading with their children and trying to teach them a love for literature?
Yeah, let's just say that it's so much a part of what we are as people and primarily as Christians. The whole story of salvation comes to us, let's not forget, in narrative form. You know, we've been hearing it for centuries. We've been learning it. We've been taught it. It's been preached to us. We have access to it now in a ubiquitous way on bookshelves, on apps for our phone. So our whole purpose of being human, salvation, being united to God through Jesus Christ, comes to us in narratives. So in order to appreciate that and live in that, I think it's good if we engage it. And of course, we engage one another too. So parents, read with your children, encourage them. If you want help with that, I think that's what this tutorial is going to offer. Maybe some steps and some examples to leading them gently by the hand into something they might not already have a love and appreciation for, but a love and an appreciation we do need on some level because we're people.
Yes, and yeah, you said it so perfectly. Thank you so very much, Father, for being our guest. Before we sign off, I want to remind everybody to check out the St. Athanasius Academy of Orthodox Theology. The website is in the comments section, saaot.edu. Check it out. They have many offerings for many different ages and many different subjects. Also, coming up in October, on October 19th, the Department of Missions and Evangelism will host a digital evangelism conference. This is a free online conference. There's a list of speakers lined up to give presentations about 30 minutes each. And again, this is free. So sign up, check it out. The website for that is orthodoxevangelism.com, and it is also in the comment section. I'm looking for all the comments and questions, Father. There are no questions. The only comment is from Deacon Adam, who is peering out from underneath his on assignment rock. Apparently, he's tuning in.
Is he
wherever
giving
he may be. So Deacon Adam should be back, God willing, next week.
Okay.
With another wonderful guest. This has been Stories That Work, coming to you from Alaska and Iowa. And thank you for tuning in, and check out the Department of Missions and Evangelism Facebook page for all the new updates and events going forward. Father Fred, Wish you a joyous feast of the Dormition of the Theotokos. Thank you for being our guest.
Please, thank you. Appreciate it.